My father was Robert Lee Johnson, and he was named after his uncle, who was also Robert Johnson. And I actually have a picture of my father with his uncle. So I know where the name comes from. Let's see, who am I? I'm a curious person. I've always been curious. And I look for consistency, and I get perturbed when I see inconsistency. I wonder how that happened. And then I go looking, and I find that in history, especially in historical narratives. And so when I see gaps, I always wonder what's in that gap. So some of my very first memories on this planet are of my family in the wintertime in Pocatello, Idaho. I was born in Pocatello, Idaho in April 1956 at Bannock Memorial Hospital in Pocatello, which is a college town, a little small college town in southern Idaho. My parents, I guess the story goes, and how did they get to Pocatello? Which everyone would say, well, how did they get to Pocatello? I've managed to look at my family history on my father's side. I was able to go as far back as my great-grandfather, Floyd Johnson, who left an area in Georgia called Beavers Falls in Oglethorpe County. And he went to Athens, Georgia, where he raised his family as a sharecropper. There was an incident while they were sharecropping, and this is a story that you find with a lot of families, especially dealing with sharecropping. And there's a whole history behind sharecropping that that really needs to be looked at to see just, how this form of re-enslavement affected people years after the supposed end of slavery. Anyway, one of the ways that they would, the landowner would keep a sharecropping family bound to the land was through debt. The way that it worked was that in planting time, the landowner would basically front you seed, material, whatever you needed to start your crop, with the idea that sharecropping meant that part of the crop would go to the landowner, part to yourself. But you also had to deal with issues of who owned the company store, for instance. Where were you buying your food from? And a lot of times, because it was an agrarian economy, everything kind of rose and fell on planting season and harvesting. So at harvest, well, you had money. That's when you were supposed to get paid. So what the landowner would do would be to loan you that money up front. And of course, they charged ridiculous interest. Most people, black and white, especially in rural Georgia, were illiterate or semi-literate at best. And so it was just a ripe opportunity for the abuse of that system, because it was easy for that person to say, well, according to my ledgers and everything that I've lent you, and the price of your crops, you still owe me. So you worked hard all year and you're still in the hole, to never get out. So you'll always be attached to that land, because the local laws would not let someone who owed money, if you owed money to a landowner, you couldn't leave. Couldn't leave the state, couldn't leave the county, okay? Because you were bound to that land through debt. So it was very important when a sharecropper was able to keep his own books and to be able to say, hey, this is the fair division. Well, that happened with my grandfather's father, Floyd Johnson. Floyd Johnson, my great-grandfather, was a sharecropper, and of course, there came a time when my grandfather, Pompey Johnson, was then a boy, but he was literate. He knew how to read and write. My grandfather was always, even though he didn't have access to a lot of education, he was very interested in educating. He was an autodidact. He taught himself. He would, even my recollection of him was how he would, read. I was always seeing him reading the newspaper. He was reading his Bible. He was reading something, but he always enjoyed being on top of current events. And he cherished that. And that was one reason why, for instance, all of my aunts, my father's sisters, were all educators. Of course, my father had learned to be a carpenter at a young age, and after he came back from the Korean War, he got involved with tool and die, and eventually worked in the aerospace industry. Anyway, the reason I had mentioned my grandfather Pompey was because he was literate at that time, even as a young kid, and he kept the books. And so his father was confident enough in his ability where he said, here's our ledger, and it says that this is what you owe us. And he said, no, that's what you owe me. And when he argued with him and said, no, this is what he said, you don't cross-talk me. And of course, Jim Crow South, you don't argue with white people, especially landed gentry. And he set his pet Negro, because they wouldn't do it themselves, to basically beat my grandfather half to death. When his sons found out, because he barely made it back, when they found out, they basically got together. They went back, they killed the pet Negro, and they killed the landowner. They came back home, they told their father what they had done, and the father said, hey, load up the wagons, it's time to go. So they left. Unfortunately, we had other relatives who lived in the area, and some of them actually owned land and didn't want to leave. And fortunately, there was some lynching and things that were done as they left because they couldn't get a hold of the people they wanted to. So some of those family members were killed. My grandfather got as far as Kentucky because of his injuries. It was hard for him to travel. So I believe my understanding was at least one or two of his daughters stayed with him in Kentucky to tend to him while the rest of them fled to Cincinnati. Once they cross the river, they get to Cincinnati. But my Uncle Ike, who was already known for being armed, carrying a gun, and he was just known as a bad nigga. So he was the one who made the paper. And of course that spooked him. It's like, okay, Cincinnati's not far enough. It's like, we're just barely across the river because there's the river right there. We need to move further. So they moved to Toledo. And so in each city, a few of the siblings stayed. Like there were a few that stayed in Cincinnati. They get to Toledo, and some of the other brothers and a few of them, they stay in Toledo. But my Uncle Ike had gone to a little town in southern Idaho where he had heard that the railroad was building a junction, and it was called Pocatello, named after Chief Pocatello. Anyway, he told his brother, my grandfather, that there was work there. And this is in the early 20s. So they traveled from Toledo to Pocatello, where they were able to get jobs with the railroad and build the junction. It was called the Oregon Short Line. So they actually built that. And again, to digress, that was one reason why my father and I were in the Rose Parade when they were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the unification of the Continental Railroad. So that's why we were, because of my family's history with the railroad. So anyway, my Uncle Ike and my grandfather actually snuck back into Georgia once they had gotten established in Pocatello and brought the women out who would be their wives. And it was a mother and daughter. So Uncle Ike married the mother, and my grandfather married the daughter. So my grandmother's mother married my Uncle Ike. Okay. So they all lived in Pocatello. My grandfather had a family there. My father was born there, and his siblings. My grandfather actually kind of they also founded the Baptist church there in the city. So the railroad would actually go through my grandfather to hire people for the railroad out of that church. So that helped build his profile in the community. There was a segregated area in Pocatello. It was called the Triangle. And that's where all the black people, the brown people, the yellow people, and Greeks, because this is before mid-century Greeks and Greeks, Italians, and Greeks, Jews, and Italians, and also what are those other people? The Irish were not white yet, so they were all in that one area called the Triangle. And that was the segregated area. The Klan was very, very visible. They actually had a headquarters in downtown Pocatello, and the building had KKK. In the building, it was built by Klansmen. Okay, just in case you weren't sure, they built their own building. So they lived in an area that was hostile, but not as hostile as where they came from, because they had come from Jim Crow, Georgia. So Southern Idaho was hostile, but because there weren't as many black people, it wasn't as hostile. The white people didn't feel as threatened. They felt more threatened by the Native Americans, who they treated horribly. And I believe I could go into that. It's insane. Because of course now with my family living there, I have relatives who are Shoshone, who live and work on the reservation there. Anyway, on the flip side of that, that's my father's side of the family and how they got to Pocatello. My mother's side of the family was from New Orleans. So I was able to go back to about 1811 on that one. I see you smiling. I had a relative named Elizabeth Claude. And Elizabeth Claude had been enslaved by a man named Brule, who sold her to Mr. Claude, Etienne Claude. Mr. Claude owned a mirror factory. He owned a mirror factory in New Orleans. That was what he did. And so he bought her and had 2 children by her, Atos and Claudia. And the reason I can see those names is because the names appear generationally. So she had 2 children by him. And so as he's going back to New Orleans, she basically says, as they're liquidating everything, and the agent comes and basically tells her, we're going to sell you and your kid as part of liquidating the property because you're his property. And she says no. And I have a receipt. I paid $500 for my freedom and the freedom of our children. And I have a receipt for $250. And I say, yeah, so, but you said 500 was the deal. So she actually went to court, okay, in antebellum New Orleans. She went to court to plead her case for freedom. Was she a free woman of color, or was she an enslaved woman? And the miracle of that was that she had standing in court, in an antebellum court. And what ended up happening was that it was stayed. Basically, the argument was, okay, you have a receipt for $250. It's supposed to be $500. Evidently, because she ends up staying, she came up with the other $250. Okay, so the case gets dropped. But the amazing part of that was that she had standing in court as a woman of color. Okay, because black women, enslaved women, were not able, supposedly. But here's this woman who's fighting to keep from being re-enslaved because she had been allowed to live as a free woman. In there was in New Orleans, in Jefferson Parish, there was a village. It was called Mechanics Village of free people of color, and that's where she lived. So she did not live with her enslaver. She lived as a free woman. And so this guy comes back all these years later and says, "We're about to sell you into slavery," and she's an old woman now, So, but she was able to win that. Over the years, like I said, that side of the family Claudes have been in New Orleans, since, well, obviously 1811, On my grandmother's side, that's my grandfather's side of the family. They were the Claudes, a very Black Creole family. On my grandmother's side, they were Black Creoles also, Washingtons. And my grandmother's grandfather was actually Irish. He was a Civil War soldier. During the Civil War, as immigrants came into the country, German immigrants, Irish immigrants, a lot of them, especially during the Civil War, joined the Army. So the Union Army didn't just speak English. There was German being spoken, Gaelic, all these different languages, which often made it very difficult for military leaders to order the troops around because there was a language problem. Anyway, a lot of the Irish soldiers who had become Teamsters later on, because of the way of immigration, they didn't bring women. It was mainly men. Most of them by the end of the Civil War found themselves in the South, and a lot of the Irish soldiers married Black women, including one of them married my great-great-grandmother. So my great-grandfather's father was an Irish man named George Malone, and he fought in the Civil War. When he became a naturalized American citizen, he was so happy about it that he changed his name to Washington to honor George Washington, because his name was George Malone. So now he became George Washington. And that's where the Washington sides of my family comes from, through that union. And my grandmother used to tell me that when she was a little kid, that she remembers sitting on her grandfather's lap, and that he would sing a little ditty, and he would sing, "My name is Georgie Malone, I'm a critic and a crone, and those who don't like me, just leave me alone." Which gives you maybe a little insight into what was going on in his life as an Irishman being married to a Black woman in the South. I always found that interesting when my grandmother would mention that ditty. So, and that was not uncommon. There were a lot of Irish who married into Black families during that time, and later, especially because of the Irish famine and the war, things like that. Anyway, so my grandfather marries my grandmother, and he decided, they get married in the 30s. He decided he didn't want to raise his children under Jim Crow. And in 1938, I believe it was 1938, 39, he's looking for a new place. He had gotten a job on the railroad. He was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. A. Philip Randolph. And I always say this because this had a lot to do with not just me growing up, but my political outlook. You know how you used to walk into black people's homes and you would see like, there would be a picture of like white Jesus, and then there would be like John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. Well, you went to my grandparents' house. Well, they had white Jesus, but they had A. Philip Randolph. Okay. Now, as a kid, because of my grandfather's work, I knew who who A. Philip Randolph was as a union, and we were a very pro-union household. So that kind of shaped some of my political outlook. My grandfather basically looked at the East Coast, and he didn't like the East Coast, New York and all that. It snowed, and he didn't think that was, a lot of fun. So I got to tell you something else in here too. So anyway, he decided to look on the West Coast, and San Francisco Bay Area was nice, but he liked Los Angeles, and brought his family up to Los Angeles in the late 30s, and there was another reason why I'm sure he didn't want to be on the East Coast, because later on we found out he had a whole nother family on the East Coast out of New York. So, so I'm just glad that he decided to bring us out here to California, okay? Made everything work. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be sitting in this chair talking to you about it. So, yeah, my grandfather was kicks. Anyway, my father, like I said, he grew up in Idaho, but when he gets to he's about to be in his senior year in high school, and he decides that he doesn't want to get drafted, that he would rather join the Merchant Marines. So he's putting in his seaman papers and everything, and he comes down to Los Angeles and enrolls in Jefferson High School, and he's living with an uncle right at 35th and Central. So my father actually graduated from Jefferson High School, and he would tell me about how when he was in high school, he would go up on Central Avenue, and especially like the Club Alabama, all the clubs, they didn't have air conditioning. So they would open up the windows, and they could go up there and they would listen to people like Count Basie and all the jazz greats, Billie Holiday sing, and listen to them as they rehearsed. So they would just sit there by the open windows and listen to them. And because they were too young to go to the clubs at the time, because they were, still in high school. Even though some of their classmates who were in the jazz band at the school were actually playing in the clubs. So, yeah, my father explained that to me. Unfortunately, before his Merchant Marine papers came through, he got drafted. So he fought in Korea, and he fought. In those days, the Army was still segregated, so he fought in a segregated black unit that was known as the Buffalo Soldiers. He was a survivor when his unit was overrun by the North Koreans and Chinese early in the war. Their whole company was wiped out. Only 6 of them survived, my father being one of them. And my father would explain to me, he told me how he laid in the mud pretending like he was dead for 3 days. Matter of fact, one of his friends had been blown apart pretty badly, so he had pulled his body over his, hoping that because it was so mangled and basically disgusting that it would keep the Chinese and Korean soldiers from noticing him under the body. He put the body over him as he laid in the mud for 3 days. And then after that, they were trying to walk back to the American lines, which, if you know anything about the early on American forces in the Korean War, they were losing, so the lines kept falling back, further back. So as they were trying to get to the American lines were moving away from them. But eventually they were able to get back. With 4 months left on my dad's tour of duty, they actually integrated the Army. And they had a ceremony where they disbanded the Buffalo Soldier unit. And I actually have that on film, the disbanding of the unit. And my father was integrated into the U.S. Army. You have to keep in mind that the soldiers, the black soldiers, were given, they were given leftovers from World War II. Uniforms, weapons, ammunition, everything had been left over from World War II. They were not getting new anything. Even the black artillery companies that were firing artillery from World War II. So you would have a problem with short rounds. So my father was explaining to me how when they were dug in, they were receiving fire from the Chinese and the North Koreans in front of them, because they were down in the valley, and then on the ridges were two white units, and then in the back was the black artillery unit. But every now and then they would have the powder would be bad because it's old, from World War II. And so it would be a short round, and they'd get a call. They said, well, a short round, which meant that round was going to fall on them. So they were actually taking fire from behind them and in front of them. Okay. When he was reintegrated into the U.S. Army, my father was just shocked, because since he had been in Korea, they weren't given hot food. They walked everywhere. All of a sudden, he's like, I'm in a new army. I got a new uniform. He had even weapons. Okay, he went from I think he had an M1 Garand, and he ends up getting a carbine. He gets a more modern weapon, right down to the boots and everything. Food, he was amazed. He says, we get hot food in the morning, and then they put us on a truck and they drive us. He said we had to walk everywhere, and they had been eating cold rations. So there was a difference there, and that struck him, because nobody had to tell him about racism. He was watching institutionalized racism and how it directly affected him and the people around him. And that stayed with him. That's why he was such a staunch supporter of Martin Luther King, besides the fact that they were the same age also. Okay, that was that generation. So I was always amazed that my father would be patriotic because of his service. But he realized when he came home that he couldn't be served in a lot of the places, because my father would travel on the road a lot. And if he was with the family, he would send my mom in because he didn't want to be humiliated when they didn't serve him. Okay? So that was the issue, and I watched that. What had happened was, after the war, when my father came back, he was living in Los Angeles. My mom was actually in high school. She was at LA High, so she was obviously living in Los Angeles. And they ended up getting together, and when my mom came out of high school, she married my dad. And that's how I got here. My dad took my mom back up to Pocatello. They lived there. My mom really wasn't, she wasn't into the rural lifestyle in southern Pocatello, coming from Los Angeles. So she ended up coming back to Los Angeles. So my father and my mom, we lived right off of 54th for a while as a kid. But eventually they ended up getting divorced, which was difficult because my mom was still going to school to become an X-ray technician. So we, first we stayed with relatives, and that wasn't working so hot because you know how relatives can be sometimes. And my mom would rent rooms, stuff like that, and we would stay there. One time, my mom was renting a room. They used to have apartment buildings where you would rent a single room, and or I should say they were probably what they call it, dwellings that were turned into apartments, put it that way. Anyway, and they tended to be older. And one time we were in this room, and the furnace was broken. It was leaking gas, and we were knocked out. And somebody was banging on the door because they could smell the gas outside, and they got us out. So that kind of freaked my mom out and everybody. So we ended up moving to Nickerson Gardens after that. And you have to remember this about Nickerson Gardens. Nickerson Gardens in the late 50s was still pretty new. And it wasn't the Nickerson Gardens that you see today. Nickerson Gardens originally was part of the defense housing that was put up for during World War II when they were bringing in defense workers. And there was a serious shortage of housing, especially in the Black community, and that's where a lot of the projects like Jordan Downs and the PJs, all those, that's where they came from. Because of restrictive covenants and segregation in housing, with the influx of the Great Migration during World War II, the Black community was just overcrowded. The area that we know as Little Tokyo, during World War II, because they had put all the Japanese in concentration camps, to ease the housing situation in the Black community, they allowed Black people to come into the area that had just been vacated by all the Japanese. The Japanese, by law, were not allowed to own property. So this property was basically owned by Caucasians who took advantage of the influx of people. So they would take an apartment that was meant for one family and divide it up so they get 4 families in there. So, of course, with the overcrowding in Little Tokyo, slum-like conditions came about fairly quickly, simply because that was overcrowded also. So the outcry went out, and that's why they started building public housing. In those days, public housing, basically people, you had the working poor. They were working, they were still poor. So you could get a job on the Alameda corridor, manufacturing, GM, Chrysler, Ford, they were all on the Alameda corridor, the steel plants. And a lot of people who lived in Nickerson or Jordan Downs actually worked there, especially in the 50s and early 60s. Unfortunately, Black people had a very difficult time trying to work those industries because most of them were unionized, and the unions were keeping Black people out because the unions were heavily into nepotism. And they looked at these black workers as a threat to that system. So the unions were just as racist as anyone else. And you think of where the people came from. So areas like Compton, you couldn't cross Alameda. Well, Alameda was where all the jobs were. That's where the rubber, that's where Firestone rubber, that's where everything was. So if you couldn't go over there without physical harm from either vigilante groups like the Spook Hunters or the local police, well, you just couldn't participate. It took years. It didn't break down until the late 70s. And of course, we all know by the late 70s, early 80s, manufacturing then starts leaving the Alameda corridor. So, yeah, I got off a little bit there on the corridor, but the idea was that you had the working poor there. What ends up happening in Nickerson was after the Alameda corridor closes down, there are no more jobs. So the people who are in these places now are not using it as a step up. It now becomes a way of life. And you're not dealing with workers or even the worker poor. Now you're dealing with welfare recipients, and most of them tend to be women. Because you had a law where the man couldn't stay in the house. If they were receiving any kind of welfare benefits. So the whole complexion of a person living in Nickerson or Jordan Downs began to change, and it became. Nickerson is one of the largest housing projects in Los Angeles, and it became one of the largest concentrations of intense poverty. And we saw the results of that by 1965. So it didn't take long. We're talking about a period of 5 years or so. So anyway, so we lived there, and while we were living there, my mother and my father had divorced. By then, I have two brothers. One who's like a little infant guy, Kenneth, the youngest one. He was born while we were there in Nickerson. We call him the makeup baby. And anyway, my mother remarries. She's introduced to my stepfather by her sister. She had a half-sister named Odile. And Odile was married to John Childress. Dr. John Childress was a physicist. Not many black physicists in 1960, okay? And he happened to know this young man from Chicago named James Ferguson, who was an aerospace engineer. And they introduced, my uncle introduced my stepfather to my mom. And of course, they ended up getting married. They pooled their resources, and they bought a home in Compton.